So hello everyone, just while we're waiting for people to come in, I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes so that the numbers can even out before I start doing the intro. So if you just hang in for a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Number's still going up, so we'll just give it a few more minutes. Okay, I think I'll start then, and people can continue to join while I'm doing the introduction. So I just wanted to start by saying hello, everyone, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Book and Paper Group, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. Just before we start, I need to cover a few housekeeping items. So firstly, our hashtag is conservation together at home, and I'll put that into the chat box so that you can copy paste it into your social media if that's what you want to do. Also, I'm sure you all know by now that we're using our home internet, so do please be patient with us if there are any technical issues. If the meeting ends suddenly, you'll be able to rejoin using the same link that you used to join in the first instance once the webinar has reopened. But I don't anticipate that to happen at all, and hopefully it won't. Emma and her colleagues have kindly agreed for this talk to be recorded, so it will be up on the ICON Book and Paper Group webpage as soon as possible after the talk has finished. We will have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end, but if you think of any questions during the talk, do feel free to pop them into the Q&A window that you can access at the bottom of your screen. So then all it leaves me to do is to introduce our next speaker, who is Emma Nichols. Emma has been working as a book and paper conservator at Cambridge University Library for the last 7 years. She gained her MA in 2013 in the conservation of books and archival materials from Camberwell College of Arts, having previously studied fine art and art history at Aberystwyth University. Whilst at Cambridge University Library, Emma has worked on a diverse range of materials, including fragments from the Cairo Geniza, World War II archives from Singapore, 15th and 16th century Grace books from the University Archives, the collagen analysis of parchment, and 15th century incunabula hortus sanitatis. Oh man, sorry about that. She's passionate about the education of new conservators and sits on the ARA Conservation Training Scheme Committee. So with that, I'm going to unmute you, Emma, and you can take it away. There you go.
Hello. Thanks, Holly. I'm delighted to be part of this Conservation Together at Home webinar series. I've really enjoyed all the fantastic webinars that have been going since the end of March, which seems a very long time ago now that it's June. So thank you to ICON and the Book and Paper Group. I found it really comforting having something that brings us all together, even though we're physically separated. So this presentation may be a repeat for some of you, as I gave it at the ICON Book and Paper Conference in Oxford in October 2018. It's also been published as a post-print with all my references and some images in the conference proceedings journal, which you can find on the ICON website, and I've put a link to that on the final slide. So if you've heard it before, I hope you don't mind hearing it again, and if you're new, then I hope you enjoy. This talk is particularly appropriate to be revisited in 2020, as it's the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, and we'll be marking 75 years since the end of the war in the East with VJ Day in August. So let's begin. Between October 2015 and June 2017, I was project conservator for the Voices of Civilian Internment World War II Singapore archive. Held at Cambridge University Library, the archive belongs to the Royal Commonwealth Society and contains around 4,000 leaves of material created by and connected to civilians who were interned on Singapore during World War II. The archive was conserved, digitised and launched on Cambridge Digital Library thanks to funding from the Wellcome Trust. One item in the archive, a nominal roll seen here on the right, became the subject of a more in-depth project thanks to additional funding. It is this project that will be the focus of this talk. However, to begin, I'll give a brief overview of the history of the archive and the significance of the nominal roll. When World War II began, British civilians living overseas were requested by the UK government to stay where they were and continue working to support the war effort. There had been plans to evacuate women and children living on Singapore to Australia, but the speed of the Japanese invasion caught many people by surprise. 3 days after the official surrender of Singapore in February 1942, all British civilians were required to report for internment, from where they were marched to Changi Jail, a grim concrete building in the eastern part of the city that would serve as their internment camp. Although built to house 600 inmates, roughly 2,500 civilians were confined in the jail. They were separated by gender, with boys over 12 being considered adults, so separated from their mothers. Though mainly British citizens, the final roll call from August 1945 revealed there were people from more than 20 countries. The internees lived in terrible conditions under extreme stress, on meagre rations of rice and beans. In the 3 years they were interned, the average man lost 29% of their body weight, and a snail farm was set up as a desperate attempt to ingest some protein. Red Cross parcels containing essential supplies and medicine were blocked from entering the camp, and the lack of nutrition and hygiene meant diseases were endemic. Although food and medicine were strictly controlled, the internees were largely allowed to organise themselves, and they had access to typewriters, pens, and scraps of paper. This enabled them to keep their own records, document their situation, and even produce newsletters, which were circulated around the camp to share news and raise morale. The survival of this material after the war is largely due to Hugh Bryson, an internee and member of the Malayan Civil Service. After the war, he collected original documents, diaries and correspondence, and encouraged people to write their memoirs. The material from the men's camp, combined with those created in the years afterwards, forms the Voices of Civilian Internment archive. Survivors of internment rarely spoke of their traumatic ordeal, meaning the content of the archive is of international significance and of particular interest to the families of internees, historians, and scholars of malnutrition and tropical diseases. Composed of poor quality 20th century materials, and with many items stored in the humid and squalid conditions of the internment camp, meant much of the archive had deteriorated to a stage where it was unable to be safely handled. In particular, one of the nominal rolls stood out during the pre-conservation survey as being particularly vulnerable, pictured here on the right. The nominal rolls are bindings composed of paper notebooks, like school exercise books, bound into hard covers with a stab sewing. They were used by the internees as working volumes to document their personal data. The text is typed with pen and ink annotations. They list the name, date of arrival in the camp, marital status, occupation, age, nationality, and camp address of every civilian interned, and are arranged in 3 parts: men, women, and children. They also record who passed away during internment by means of a thin red line and a date drawn through a record. Due to containing such personal information, the nominal rolls are some of the most heavily consulted items in the archive, as they are often the first resource used by those trying to trace relatives and friends. One nominal roll was able to be handled and digitised safely. However, the other had suffered extensive moisture damage. This had resulted in the loss of paper and ink, the loss of paper and text, the bleeding of inks, and the delamination of the boards. Some of the remaining paper was very weak and at high risk of further damage and loss. Traditional practice for conserving similarly moisture and mould damaged paper usually requires the separation and individual treatment of leaves, with more recent practices of bound items using alcohols or a brush adhesive brush application of an adhesive. As the binding was undamaged and significant to the roll's history, it was decided that any conservation would need to be undertaken in situ, that is, without disbinding. This, coupled with the delicate fibrous nature of the paper and the fugitivity of the inks in both water and ethanol, meant many commonly used treatments were not considered suitable. Knowing it would benefit from further investigation and thought, and likely a lot more time than was available, when the Wellcome Trust encouraged the project team to apply for additional funding by means of a research bursary, the roll was considered the ideal candidate. The project proposed was titled Development of an In Situ Treatment Method for 20th Century Moisture Damaged Paper. The primary aim was the longevity of the nominal roll and to stabilise it for digitisation and future consultation. To achieve this, the project consisted of three main strands: the analysis and characterisation of the composition and condition of the roll's paper using various spectral light methods, including infrared, ultraviolet, and optical microscopy. The design and execution of a bespoke in situ conservation treatment for the roll, informed by the results of the analysis and the roll's specific requirements. The digitisation of the roll and subsequent launch on Cambridge Digital Library, and public engagement with World War II Far East prisoner of war groups and families of those interned. We were successfully awarded the bursary funding, which enabled a 7-month project for the roll to be carried out, paid for the project conservator, and enabled the purchase of UV imaging equipment for the UL to assist with the analysis needed for the roll, but also for the future care of other UL collections. So, the project could begin, and the first step was the analysis of the paper. Damaged areas of the leaves were first assessed with a Dino-Lite digital microscope at the UL. This handheld USB microscope has a maximum magnification of 250 times and 3 light settings: UV, infrared, and visible. Viewing the paper through the Dino-Lite emphasised just how fibrous and delicate the damaged areas of the paper were. Due to limited access to analytical equipment at the UL, collaboration with another institution was essential when it came to more in-depth analysis and interpretation of the paper. I was thrilled to be able to work with my old conservation MA classmate, Natalie Brown, who was a researcher at the Institute for Sustainable Heritage at University College London, UCL, at the time. The roll was taken to UCL, where Natalie investigated the properties of the paper. First, the Keyence digital microscope was used to magnify the roll's paper fibres. It was established that they varied in length, width, and cellular structure, indicating that several different fibre types had been used in making the paper. As it was not possible to identify the fibres in situ, loose fibres were extracted for Natalie to conduct fibre furnish, a method of visual assessment where fibres are stained with a reagent and then observed with a microscope to try and distinguish fibre features. The results showed that the paper was composed of a mixture of bast, so flax and hemp, etc., and woody fibres. As bast fibres were commonly used in Eastern papermaking, this indicated the paper could have been made on or near Singapore. So it could be speculated that due to limited resources during the war, the paper may have been made from recycled Western and Eastern paper mixed together. As well as using the microscope, Natalie used the Souvenir system on the paper of the roll. Souvenir uses near-infrared in combination with chemometric models built from analysing Western paper. It enables paper characterisation by rapid and non-destructive measures of the chemical and physical properties important for preservation. Souvenir was able to approximate the pH, lignin, and degree of polymerization of the paper. Although a range of pH values across the roll's paper were measured, the damaged areas of the text block were acidic at 4 or less. The paper also had a low lignin content, which correlated with it being a mixture of Western and Eastern fibres. As it was designed as a surveying instrument and only the one nominal roll was assessed, it's important to acknowledge that the results gained by using Souvenir are approximations. Of most interest to me were the degree of polymerization, or DP, measurements. These approximated the average number of monomers in the macromolecule chains of a cellulose chain, which could be used to indicate the extent of water damage by how short or broken the chains were. So basically, the higher the DP number, the longer the chain and the stronger the paper. Though the bottom right corner of the nominal roll's paper had obvious clues to paper weakness, such as being fibrous and having bleeding inks, upper parts of the leaf displayed no visible signs of damage. The measurements were taken from several different areas on the leaf, and the DP varied dramatically. Areas at the top of the leaf measured over 1,000 DP units, whereas at the bottom corner, where there was more obvious damage, measurements were reduced to 500 DP units. Natalie informed me that recent studies had indicated that 300 DP units is the usability threshold for Western papers. What was of particular interest was how dramatically the results varied over a really short distance, and how far up the leaf the lower DP measurements extended. In the middle of the forage, the measurements decreased over 500 DP units in only 3 millimeters, which was quite surprising given that the area in question had no obvious clues visually to damage. It was possible to theorize that the DP measurements indicated the extent of moisture ingress and damage across the leaf, and it would be interesting to see if the UV imaging results corroborated the DP readings. So back at the UL, the leaves of the roll were imaged under UV light. It was immediately clear that there was an area of each leaf that did not fluoresce. This started at the bottom corner of each leaf, where there was visible moisture damage, and spread up the leaf to where the DP measurements had still indicated 500 units or less. As the paper predated 1950, this lack of fluorescence was unlikely to be due to optical brightness being washed from the paper. However, without further testing, it was not possible to identify whether this was due to dirt being absorbed or to biodeterioration. Either way, it could be confidently acknowledged that there had been disturbance to the paper, and that the disturbance covered a larger area than was visible with the naked eye. When comparing the UV images with the DP measurements, it was found they corresponded accurately with one another. This meant the UV images could be used as a rough guide to the parameters of moisture ingress and damage of each leaf, and therefore inform how far any conservation treatment should potentially extend. So, with the results of the analysis in hand, the next step was to devise a conservation treatment for the vulnerable paper leaves of the roll. There were a number of factors that needed to be considered in order for treatment of the paper to be carried out safely and successfully. The key requirement was to impart strength and support to the paper, thereby minimising the risk of further loss of material. It was felt that this would be best achieved by the application of an adhesive and supportive conservation grade tissue. Next, the ethical decision to not disbind the roll meant any treatments to the leaves would need to be carried out in situ. Thirdly, the fugitivity of the handwritten inks in both water and ethanol meant as minimal moisture as possible should be used in treating the paper. Fourth, as the paper was soft, fibrous, and had significant damage to the cellulose chains, the risk of forming tide lines from moisture and disturbing the fibres was considerable, so a controlled and gentle application method needed to be used. Lastly, the expansive area needing treatment had to be taken into account. The DP measurements and UV imaging had shown the damage extended further across the leaf than one might visually identify, with some leaves needing an area as large as 180 by 130 millimeters treated. Research and conservation literature had found limited options for this combination of requirements. it was felt that a brush application of adhesive should be avoided, as the soft fibrous paper could be easily disturbed, and the moisture sensitivity meant there was a high risk of creating tide lines. Using remoistenable tissue would prove complex given the size of the area needing treatment, and there was concern that the low amount of adhesive used in remoistenable tissue would not penetrate the paper fibres sufficiently to provide the strength needed. A method of adhesive application was suggested by the senior conservator at the UL. An aerosol generator, or ultrasonic mister, could allow greater control over the amount of moisture applied to the paper and minimise the risk of oversaturation and/or disturbance to the fibres. So the next stage was to find an adhesive with the properties required, which were flexibility, a mid to high pH to counteract the acidity of the paper, strength to adhere the tissue, and a low viscosity so that it could become airborne in the aerosol generator. A list was compiled of adhesives recommended for use, and as it's obviously very dangerous and volatile to use alcohols in vapour form, all adhesives would be made up with water. Adhesives with weaker adhesion properties, such as phenori, were disregarded, and instead stronger adhesives such as Klucel, gelatin, isinglass and methylcellulose were investigated. The highest percentage at which each would become vapour was determined by gradually increasing the percentages of solutions. 5 adhesives of those tested created a vapour: methylcellulose A4C, Klucel G and E, gelatin and isinglass, and the highest percentages that each reached are listed on the screen. pH measurements were taken of each of the viable solutions before their ability to adhere tissue with minimal disturbance to a substrate was tested. This was conducted by examining the success of each vapour in adhering 2 GSM Berlin tissue to Dutch FE migration test paper and small moisture damaged paper samples, and then visually monitoring any disturbance to the ink. Each adhesive was observed subjectively by eye and touch to monitor for discoloration or visual changes, and their flexibility, any residual tackiness and/or shrinkage upon drying were all monitored. All tests were conducted on the suction table to minimise health risks and to help the adhesive better penetrate the paper. At the end of testing, the methylcellulose and Klucel G were discounted because their low percentages meant they were ineffective at adhering tissue. So the choice was now narrowed down to 3: gelatin type B, Klucel E and isinglass. But it was now the in situ conditions in which the treatment would be applied needed to be replicated. Although the suction table had been used in the initial testing, this would not be possible when working on the bound nominal roll. The suction table at the UL has a suction wedge attached to the table by a hose, and it was theorised that this could provide the solution for portable directional suction. In order to test the wedge, a method for securely and safely positioning it behind each individual leaf during treatment needed to be found. So a perspex frame was designed, which would stand over the open nominal roll and allow for a leaf at a time to be laid across it. Satafil, a breathable polyester mesh, was sewn over the window in the frame to support the leaf being worked on and to prevent it sagging through the window when the suction was turned on. The suction wedge was held in position behind the frame with a lab stand. As the wedge was smaller than the leaf, during application of adhesive, the wedge would be moved along the window to sit where necessary. To test the adhesive and tissue application with the frame and the wedge, a model of the nominal roll was created by further aging one of the books from the UL's disaster salvage training kit. All 3 adhesives worked, but due to their high percentages, the isinglass and gelatin adhered the tissue more successfully than the Klucel E. Between the isinglass and the gelatin type B, it was decided the isinglass would be used for treating the roll. It had a higher percentage of adhesive in vapour form, was strong yet flexible, and had a neutral pH in comparison to gelatin's more acidic one. So conservation could begin. The text block was dry cleaned, and the delaminating corners and edges of the boards were consolidated with wheat starch paste. And then the paper leaves of the text block were treated one leaf at a time. A leaf was laid across the frame on top of a sheet of bondina. The folds were turned down and the damaged areas realigned. A scale photograph of the leaf to be worked on, taken under UV light, was then used as a guide for shaping the size and shape of repair tissue. Berlin tissue was laid over the photograph on the Melinex and shaped with a needle. The suction wedge was turned on and a fine layer of adhesive vapour applied to the leaf. The shaped tissue was carefully laid in position on the leaf and rubbed down with a bone folder through silicone paper. More adhesive vapour was applied on top of the tissue and then rubbed down again through silicone paper. The wedge was moved along the leaf under the window until the whole area had been treated. Once the leaf was treated, the suction wedge was turned off and removed, the leaf supported with the bondina and the frame lifted away. The leaf was then laid flat between bondina, blotter, boards and a weight. The frame and the wedge were then returned to their positions over the drying leaves, and the next leaf to be worked on was laid on the frame. And you can see in the image, just to the left, the one of me working, you can see under the frame, there's the drying leaves there, and they're under bondina and then some mount board, and you can just see a weight poking out from under the frame. Depending on the fragility of the leaves, which were in a poorer condition at the beginning of the roll, there was a tiered system of treatment. Aerosol adhesive was applied to the weakened area, followed by tissue, with the same procedure on the other side of the leaf if it was still weak once the first side had dried. Upon completing the text block repairs, a flax paper cover and a 4-flat folder were made for the roll. A box was made with a sheet of Art-Zorb, moisture-sensitive silica paper, mounted in the lid to counter any fluctuations in humidity once the roll was back in the storeroom stacks. Despite the complex requirements of the nominal roll, the conservation treatment was a success. There was no further disturbance to the paper or the inks, and although the leaves were still fairly delicate, they were no longer vulnerable, could be handled more easily, and were digitised safely. The aerosol generator proved to be a reliable, controlled, and minimal moisture way of applying adhesive. Being able to carry out the treatment without disturbance to the binding and being able to work effectively on one leaf at a time was paramount to the treatment's success. The ability to use suction, thanks to the suction wedge and the perspex frame, meant the adhesive vapour could be applied with control and direction. This resulted in minimal risk to the health of the conservator and maximum results in penetrating the paper. And the combination of adhesive and tissue was effective at imparting strength and support to the weak areas of the leaf. The insights provided by optical microscopy, near-infrared and UV imaging meant the areas of the paper in need of support could be confidently defined, and thus repairs could be directed accordingly. Thanks to this, repairs were able to extend beyond the parameters of damage onto stronger, healthier paper and did not create invisible areas of weakness. Once conservation and digitisation of the nominal roll and the rest of the Voices of Civilian Interment archive was completed, there were several events, an exhibition and presentations given to celebrate the launch of the archive on Cambridge Digital Library. The most poignant of these was an event held at the UL to mark the anniversary of VJ Day in August 2017, attended by surviving internees, their families and friends, and families of those who've been interned. Hearing their stories and seeing their faces as they saw the archive firsthand and found the names of their families and of themselves in the nominal roll was unforgettable. The conservation and subsequent global accessibility through digitisation of the archive means the voices of the internees in their ordeal are not lost in history, but retained for generations to come, serving as a humbling reminder of human resilience. There are links on the screen to the postprint of this talk on the ICON website that includes my references, lists of all materials and equipment used and where you can get them. And there's also a link here to blog posts written about the project and the archive in its entirety on Cambridge Digital Library. I've also included mine and Natalie's email addresses if you have any further in-depth questions or think of anything you want to ask us at a later date. Thank you.
I'm coming back in, Emma. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really interesting and actually really great to see it again, having seen it at the ICON Book and Paper Group conference. It was really nice to get a refresher on it. We've got some questions here already. Oh, the first one I wanted to ask was the woven polyester mesh that you put over the Perspex frame for the pages. Can you just say the name of that material again and maybe spell it if possible?
Yes. It took a lot of investigation to find out what that was. We had it in the roll cupboard and I sent off samples of it to various people in the end in desperation because it was perfect for what we needed it for. It's called Satifil, which is S for sugar, AATIFIL. And I think preservation equipment sell it.
Okay, great.
That's where we sorted it in the end. But yeah, it will be in the materials list of my post print. But yeah, I think it's L and it's Satifil.
Satifil, thank you. So we've got a question here from Gracily Celine Roxas. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. It says, does Souvenir actually measure pH or does it approximate pH based on IR data? Were there other methods done to measure pH of the paper?
Well, I think, is Natalie present?
Yeah, so I can actually, Natalie, I'm just going to unmute you. You should be able to talk now. Oh, she's still on mute. Hang on.
You hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, hi. Yeah, so yeah, you're right. It's an approximation based on chemometric models built from NIR spectra as well as analytical pH measurements. So yeah, it's an approximation. It doesn't actually measure the pH. So all of the measurements you get from Souvenir are approximations rather than analytical values, shall we say.
Wonderful. And just to follow up on the other part of that question, Emma, did you measure the pH with any other method?
Just the test strips.
Okay.
It came out as 4, so the same as what Souvenir in that instance had read it as. So
wonderful. Thanks, Natalie.
No
You might need to jump back in if there are some more questions about this. Okay, so we've got a question here from Anjali Jain, and it says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Could you tell us a bit more about the suction wedge? Can you buy it as a separate attachment or did you make it yourself?
I have no idea. Ours is just hidden away in our suction table. And so maybe you have one hidden in your suction table and you don't even know, because ours is hidden in this random little door on the side. And it's, as far as I know, because I wasn't working there when it was purchased, it's always been a feature of our suction table. I think, again, I wasn't there when it was purchased, but I believe Alan Buchanan was involved in making, if not, I think he made our suction table. I don't want to be wrong on that. If not, he was heavily involved in the purchasing of it and in getting that one. So yeah, I don't know if they're a regular thing. I mean, yeah, it was wildly useful in this instance because it just meant you could work on a bound item because there was no way that it could have worked on the suction table without disbinding. So,
and you could control much more sort of locally, I guess, the area that you're providing the suction to.
I could still turn up and down the pressure of the suction, the amount of suction, with the suction wedge, so it's still a control as controllable as the table itself. So
great.
yeah, maybe when you all get back to your studios, have a look at your suction table.
There might be lots of them hidden away somewhere. Excellent. Okay. So we've got a question here from Robin McClanahan, which is, what type of tissue did you use for the repair work?
So I use Berlin tissue, which is a mixture of Kozo and Mitsumata fibres, and it's really light 2GSM tissue, conservation grade. And yeah, it's a very thin, fine tissue. But as I tried to explain in my the actual practical conservation application, I was doing a tiered approach to the repair of the leaves. So I would apply the vapour, apply the tissue, apply the vapour, that would all be pressed and dried, and then I was working from back to front in the binding, and once I'd finished I then went back through front to back and just saw how they all felt, and if I felt they needed more support, I was then doing another tiered approach to repair, where again I'd do a layer of adhesive vapour, then tissue, then adhesive vapour again.
And how often did you have to go? I mean, how many layers did you get to on some of them?
Oh, it was only the 2 each
Okay.
side, as in vapour, tissue, vapour. So yeah, one each side of 3 parts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that was sufficient, really, because the paper was quite thin and fine anyway. So I deliberately didn't do any infilling, because the paper was so fine and delicate, and I didn't want to change the nature of the paper. I didn't want to make it something it wasn't. So yeah, it was more about stabilising what was there, with the caveat that it was still delicate and it would still need careful handling, but it wasn't about to immediately disintegrate. Yeah, because it looked like it had been almost dunked in water, because it was that sort of triangular corner of the book that was damaged.
Yeah.
Whether dunked in water or been standing on a shelf and absorbed water up through the corner, I don't know. But. So
that kind of leads on to, we've got another question here, which is about what caused the damage. It was mold damage.
I think it was moisture damage. Maybe mold. There wasn't any evidence of mold particularly in the paper. I mean, the ink bleeding made it look on first glance like it could be mouldy, because they'd used red ink as well, and that had bled lovely. And the splotches of pinkish colour on it. But no, I don't think mould was really the issue here. It was the moisture and the fact that the paper had washed out any size, if there was any in there.
Great, thanks. We've got a comment here from Jackie Coppin Adamic, which is that they have an Allen Buchanan suction table and they also have a wedge in it. So for all of you guys out there with your Buchanan suction tables, just have a look for that useful little thing tucked away inside. You said it's sort of like in a compartment.
Yeah, it's on a random door. I think it's the same door where you change the bottles that take whatever you're working on. Words. But yeah, it's ours is on a very, very thick orange hose.
Great. We've got a question here from Harriet Gillespie, which is, did you find this method more or less time consuming than an in situ brush application of the adhesive?
Probably more time consuming, because yeah, you would impart moisture much quicker with a brush, but the whole point was what I was trying to avoid that. So yeah, I mean the whole key to this happening was obviously the funding by the Wellcome Trust in giving us the research bursary, because it allowed us, as much as it allowed us the money from a project conservator sense, it bought us time, which was the key point to this. So it enabled the analysis, and it enabled me time to conduct the treatment. So yeah, I don't know what would have been my approach. The outcome of all of this may have been different, hopefully as successful, but different if the time restriction had been there, because it was a funded project within a funded project, so it was already being conserved within time restraints.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was, yeah, I'd say it was more time consuming, but the result achieved and the fact that it didn't cause any more detrimental damage was, yeah, worth it. So.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. We've got a question here, which is from Anjali Jain again, and it says that they've always been wary of adding dilute adhesive solutions to humidifiers. Although is that what you were using? You weren't using a humidifier, were you? Using a kind of aerosol.
Yeah, so it's actually a medical piece of kit, really. Although you can get it from Thales, I think. Yeah, I think Thales. Yeah, we got ours from Thales. This is the Ricolo 100. Although I have noticed in some places it's called the Ricolo 1000. I don't know if it's the same or whether it's just a typo.
Yeah.
I think GMW sell it and Thales sell it. And it's a kind of nebulizer, I think, for medical use, but obviously we don't attach the mask attachment on the end. We have the nozzles.
Yeah. Then the other part of that question, which I didn't say, is did you have to do anything to prevent the machine from clogging?
No, but because I guess by the fact that I was only working on a set number of leaves at a time, it wasn't running for that long. So I was working on about 5 leaves at a time because I didn't want to have too many drying whilst I was working. And because of all the different elements involved in the process, I didn't want to overwhelm myself with having too much going on at once. And to be honest, that all fitted in quite well time-wise with my working day. So, you know, as we have a coffee break where we leave the studio and an afternoon tea break where we leave the studio and our lunch break, and 5 leaves at a time worked quite well with that because I'd obviously have to set up and then prepare to leave it as well as doing the work. So yeah, that worked quite well.
Yeah, and then I guess you just clean it quite thoroughly after, so it doesn't get full of
and with any
sticky adhesive.
Yeah, and with any aerosol generator, you just tap the nozzle and make sure there's no drips lurking. But yeah, because it's such low percentages, it was, you know, it needed to be low percentages in order for them to become airborne, but it also meant, yeah, the machine was fine. And I just thoroughly cleaned it all diligently every day, so.
Great.
So.
Yeah, that seems like it paid off.
I don't think I said this in here. I'm just realising that our aerosol generator has a heated hose attachment as well. So you have a hose, and it has a coil of wire running through it. So you can plug that into the back of the aerosol generator, and that heats the aerosol as it comes out. So I was putting in the isinglass warm, and then it wasn't losing too much temperature as it came through the hose.
That's good.
Again, I think that probably helped with it not clogging, because if it was rapidly cooling in the hose, that may have been more of a problem.
Oh, that's really useful. We've got a question here from Anne Mayhew, which is, did you use interleaving material between the pages after treatment? Was there any stickiness observed after you treated them?
No, they were left to dry for a very long time, sort of. Well, I say very long isn't very helpful, is it? Maybe a couple of days or so, and I was just very aware of that, especially when coming back and treating the other side of the leaves. But no, it's in its box in the stacks without interleaving, and it's been brought out a few times since treatment, and it's never had a problem with sticking to itself. So yeah.
I'm guessing when you were drying them, you put some Bondina or something.
Yeah. So they were, obviously the suction was helping pull through a lot of it as well. So they weren't overly wetted in the first place. And then there was Bondina both sides, and blotter, and the mount board pressing it all.
Great. Thank you. And then it doesn't seem like we've got any more questions. We've got some nice comments. I've got a final question then, which is, I'm curious about the the UV imaging that you created to show the sort of area of damage, and I wondered how that image of the area of damage compared to like a visual examination of the area. Was it vastly different from what you could see was damaged? Did it show you some areas of damage that you weren't able to see just by looking at them?
I'll go back. Yeah, so here we go. So yeah, this is kind of it under, on the right, we've got it just under visible light. Obviously the bottom you can see where the ink has bled, the sort of pink splodgy areas here. I don't know if you can see my mouse.
Yeah.
And then it was very damaged down. You could tell it was damaged down here, so it was much softer to touch and it just looked much more damaged. But you can see this area here, coming up here, and the fact that it extends up to here, which is where the DP reading is still high, that was much less obvious visually that there was any damage there. So yeah, it's very interesting.
To see how it brought out things that you
think. It's just interesting in general for when we're applying repairs to things. You think a lot of the time we are visually just going, oh well, because that's the best we can do. We're just thinking, oh well, here's my damage. I'll extend beyond that. How I feel is necessary, but sometimes it might be more than you think.
Yeah, and so often you have to rely on, if you don't have access to this type of equipment or imaging, you have to rely on your judgment and your experience and your sort of feel and sense of things, don't you? But it's good to know that mostly you can generally kind of tell where it is by eye. Great. Okay, well, let me just double check whether there aren't any more questions. Oh yeah, we've got one last question here. Not sure if I missed it, but I just want to clarify if the degree of polymerization is directly related with the degree of damage on the paper.
We can go back to Natalie again, if she's there.
Hello, I am here. I apologize, I'm not entirely sure what's meant by the degree of damage. So the degree of polymerization is a representation of how many monomers, so how many glucose monomers are in a cellulose polymer chain. So that's what that is. In a sense, it is directly correlated to how kind of usable a document is, or how easily the paper breaks. Does that answer the question a bit?
Yeah, I guess so. So there might be some, I mean, they haven't clarified, but if you, Grace Seal, if you want to clarify your question a bit, then I'm happy to go into it a bit more.
I'll put the final slide back up, and then it's got our email addresses and things as well.
But it sounds like, yeah, if there is a correlation between the degree of polymerization and what we might conceive of as like fragility, I guess, or...
Yes, definitely. So Emma mentioned a study that looked at the usability threshold. So what that means is when a document becomes unusable, i.e. it can't be handled without it breaking, kind of like the folding test, you know, when the corner breaks off. So the usability threshold is 300 DP units for Western paper. So that's like bleach wood pulp paper and rag paper. So yeah, there is a correlation between the DP and kind of how fragile the paper is. It's also linked to tensile strength as well. So they all kind of link to one another.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Natalie.
No problem.
So there's a couple of more questions that have just come in, which I think we have time for still. Victoria Bunting has asked, are the pages composed, are they written on only one side? So did you do repairs on both sides? But
yeah, so the wonderful thing with Berlin tissue is that it's nearly invisible when it's on and dried. So yes, it was covering text and writing, but that wasn't an issue. But there was writing both sides. The key data was on the recto of each page, and then the verso of each page had numbers and figures and things. Not being the archivist, I don't know what those related to, but yeah, there was writing on both sides.
Great, thank you. And then one final question from Anjali Jain, which is, do you think that the dark areas in UV correspond to the position on the paper where it would have been handled?
Yes, definitely. I think that whole bottom corner has suffered from multiple, from the moisture and from handling, because obviously bottom right corner of a page is where it's going to be generally turned. So I think it's all just compounded in it being very fragile.
Great.
And the loss of material. So
yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. So with that, then I'm just going to wrap up. Just let me get rid of this. I'm going to just put a link in the chat box because, as Emma said, her talk, this is a repeat of the talk that she gave at the last Book and Paper Group conference, Adapt and Evolve. And we've just made our postprints publicly available to anyone, so you can access them on the ICON website, and I've just put the link to that in the chat box there, so you can copy that if you want to. And all of, as Emma said as well, all of the links and references and things are in the article, so you can access those there. The next talk in the series is going to be tomorrow, which is Wednesday, host at 4 p.m. British summertime, and it will be hosted by the Heritage Science Group. And it will be Hayley Simon, who's a PhD student at UCL, giving their talk about the conservation of the Mary Rose cast iron cannon shot. So that will be super interesting for those of you who want to tune in for that. And then I also just need to quickly plug the Book and Paper Group. Sorry about the traffic noise in the background. The Book and Paper Group annual general meeting is scheduled to be live streamed tomorrow at 7 p.m. British summertime, and all members are welcome to join us. The AGM is going to be followed by 2 talks from this year's recipients of the Fred Behrman Research Grant, and it's finishing with a pub quiz. So there's hopefully some fun things for you to join in on there. So hopefully we'll see you there. And then it just leaves me to say thank you so much, Emma, for your talk. It was so interesting, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I'm going to end the meeting there, I think.
Thanks, Holly.
Bye. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.